The crystalline spires of Zephyria Prime gleamed under the light of twin suns, their surfaces reflecting the desperate hope that flickered in Ambassador Kelthera's compound eyes. The insectoid diplomat's mandibles clicked nervously as she adjusted her ceremonial robes, each movement betraying the weight of her impossible mission. Today, she would do something that went against every instinct her species possessed. Today, she would humble herself before the humans. The Galactic Council had debated for cycles before reaching this moment. Species after species had fallen to the Void Hunters, those ancient machines that consumed entire star systems and converted organic matter into twisted metal constructs. The Altarians, with their mighty fleet of bio-ships, had lasted 3 solar cycles. The crystalline hegemony, masters of energy manipulation, had held out for 2. Now, only a handful of species remained, scattered across the Outer Rim territories, watching helplessly as the mechanical tide swept across their galaxy. Kelthera's people, the Zetheri Collective, had always prided themselves on their logical approach to warfare. They calculated probabilities, analyzed patterns, and made decisions based on cold, hard mathematics. Every calculation pointed to the same inevitable conclusion: extinction within the next galactic year. Every scenario they ran ended the same way, except for one variable that kept appearing in their models. One species that defied their understanding of combat effectiveness ratios: the humans. Terra had been contacted barely 300 years ago, a young species that had just achieved faster-than-light travel through crude but effective fusion drives. The Galactic Council had extended the usual welcome package: basic trade agreements, cultural exchange programs, and membership in the Outer Territories Council. Most species took centuries to make any meaningful impact on galactic affairs. The Zetheri themselves had needed 500 years just to develop their current military doctrine. But humans are different. Within 50 years of first contact, they had established colonies in 17 star systems. Within a century, their merchant fleets were known throughout 3 spiral arms. And within 2 centuries, every military analyst in the galaxy had begun to take notice of something unprecedented in their databases. Human combat records were disturbing, not because they were exceptionally skilled warriors, though they certainly proved competent in that regard. Not because they possessed superior technology, though their innovation rate was remarkable. What disturbed the military analysts was how humans approached warfare itself. They seemed to have no concept of acceptable losses. They appeared incapable of surrender. And, most puzzling of all, they grew more dangerous the more desperate their situation became. The Altarian war records spoke of human mercenaries who had continued fighting for days after suffering wounds that should have incapacitated any sentient being. The crystalline archives contained footage of human ships ramming enemy vessels when their weapons ran dry, their crews singing war songs as they burned in the void. The Karath Empire had filed reports of entire human colonies choosing destruction over capture, denying their enemies any resources while taking as many with them as possible. This was the species Kelthera now approached with her impossible request. The Terran embassy on Zephyria Prime was a study in understated efficiency. Unlike the grand architectural displays favored by most species, the human building was simply a collection of interconnected domes and towers that served clear, practical purposes: landing bays, communication arrays, residential quarters, and meeting spaces. Each element designed for function rather than impression, though the overall effect was somehow more striking than the most elaborate Zetheri crystal gardens. Ambassador Sarah Chun met Kelthera in a reception room that could have belonged to any of a dozen species, carefully neutral in its decorations and furnishings. Chun herself was unremarkable by human standards. Average height, dark hair kept in a simple style, wearing the standard diplomatic uniform of deep blue with minimal ornamentation. But her eyes held an intensity that made Kelthera's chitin prickle with unease. "Ambassador Kelthera," Chun said, offering the traditional Zetheri greeting gesture with surprising accuracy. Your message indicated this was a matter of extreme urgency. Please, tell me how Terra can assist the collective. The formal politeness was exactly what Kelthra had expected, but something in Chin's tone suggested the human already knew why she had come. The Zethari ambassador arranged her robes carefully, a nervous habit her aide had repeatedly warned her about, and activated her personal translation matrix. This conversation was too important to risk any misunderstanding. Ambassador Chun, I come to you not just as a representative of the Zethari collective, but as a speaker for what remains of the Galactic Council itself. The words felt like grinding metal in her throat. We are facing a threat that has already consumed 67% of our member civilizations. Our military analysts have run every possible scenario, and our chance of survival stands at less than 4%. Chin's expression didn't change, but Kelthra noticed the subtle shift in her posture that indicated increased attention. Human body language was still somewhat mysterious to most galactic species, but the Zethari had made a study of it for obvious reasons. The Void Hunters, Chun said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Kelthra's mandibles clicked once, sharply. They appeared in the Andromeda Vector 18 months ago. We initially believed them to be another technological species, perhaps from beyond our galactic arm. Our first contact protocols failed completely. They don't communicate. They don't negotiate. They simply consume. We've been monitoring the situation, Chen admitted. Our intelligence services have been tracking the expansion pattern. The refugee ships that have reached human space have provided additional data points. Kelthra felt a moment of surprise. Human space was in the opposite direction from the Void Hunter advance, and most refugee ships barely had the resources to reach the nearest safe systems. The fact that some had traveled all the way to human territory suggested either remarkable desperation or remarkable hope. Then, you understand the magnitude of the threat, Kelthra continued. Each system they consume adds to their numbers. They convert organic matter into mechanical components and raw materials into more ships. They've grown from an estimated 50 vessels to over 12,000 in just 18 months. Exponential growth, Chen nodded. Classic von Neumann scenario, though more sophisticated than most theoretical models predicted. The casual way Chan referenced such advanced concepts reminded Kelthra why the Zethari had ultimately decided on this course of action. Humans had a disturbing tendency to be familiar with the most destructive theoretical concepts in the galaxy, often developing them independently of galactic academic institutions. Our remaining fleets have been forced into defensive positions around a handful of core systems, Kelthra said. We estimate 6 months before they reach the heart of collective space. After that, she let the implication hang in the air. You want humanity to help defend your territory, Chin said. More than that, Kelthra clicked her mandibles together in a Zethari gesture for absolute honesty. We want humanity to lead a combined fleet action against the Void Hunter forces. Our tactical analysis suggests that conventional defensive strategies will fail. We need something unconventional. The silence stretched between them for nearly a full minute. Chen's face had taken on the carefully neutral expression that humans wore when processing significant information. Finally, she leaned back in her chair and folded her hands in what Kelthra had learned was a human gesture indicating serious consideration. Ambassador, with respect, why come to us? The Terran Defense Force consists of perhaps 300 ships across all classes. The collective alone has more vessels under arms than our entire species possesses. Surely there are more logical choices for military leadership. This was the moment Kelthra had been dreading. The moment when she would have to voice the conclusion that had taken the Council months to accept. Because every military simulation we run comes to the same conclusion, Ambassador Chun. Conventional tactics will not work against the Void Hunters. They adapt to energy weapon patterns within hours. They counter shield frequencies almost instantly. They learn from every engagement and apply that knowledge across their entire network. Fighting them with traditional methods is simply feeding them information about how to defeat us more efficiently. She paused, gathering what remained of her dignity. But humans don't fight conventionally. Your tactical databases are filled with strategies that our computers classify as statistically impossible. You win battles you should lose. You find solutions where none should exist. And according to every analysis we've run, you do it by embracing concepts that other species find uncomfortable, such as Chen's tone remained carefully neutral, acceptable loss ratios that other species would consider genocidal, resource expenditure patterns that ignore long-term sustainability in favor of immediate tactical advantage, command structures that prioritize rapid adaptation over established doctrine. Kelthera's voice grew quieter, and, most importantly, a willingness to sacrifice everything to achieve victory. Chun was quiet for another long moment, and, when she spoke, her voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. Ambassador, I think you may have some misconceptions about how humans approach warfare. We don't actually seek out impossible odds or unsustainable losses. What we do is adapt our methods to match the stakes involved. When survival is on the line, different calculations apply. That's exactly what we need, Kelthera said urgently. Survival calculations. Every other species in the galaxy approaches warfare as an extension of politics, economics, or territorial disputes. Even when facing extinction, we find ourselves constrained by concepts of honor, resource preservation, and acceptable casualties. Humans seem to understand that when facing an existential threat, such concepts become not just irrelevant, but actively harmful to survival. The human ambassador stood and walked to the room's single window, looking out at the crystal spires of the Zethri capital. When she spoke again, it was with the tone of someone choosing her words very carefully. If the Terran government agrees to this request, you should understand what you're asking for. Human military doctrine, when facing an existential threat, is based on a single principle. The enemy must be destroyed completely, regardless of cost. We don't fight for territory or resources or political advantage. We fight to ensure that whatever threatened us can never threaten anyone again. That's exactly what the Void Hunters represent, Kelthera replied. An existential threat to all organic life in this galaxy. Political considerations, resource preservation, even civilian casualties become secondary to ensuring they are stopped completely. Chun turned back from the window, and Kelthera saw something in her eyes that made her chitin shiver. It wasn't anger or excitement or fear. It was the cold calculation of someone who had already begun thinking about how to destroy an enemy. I'll need complete tactical data on every engagement with the Void Hunters. Fleet compositions, weapon effectiveness ratios, their adaptation patterns, everything. I'll also need authorization for Terran intelligence to debrief every refugee and survivor who's encountered them. And I'll need the Council to understand that if we do this, it will be done our way. What does that mean specifically? Kelthera asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know. It means that human military doctrine prioritizes mission success over everything else. If we determine that saving a system requires sacrificing a fleet, we'll sacrifice the fleet. If protecting civilians means abandoning defensive positions, we'll abandon the positions. And if stopping the Void Hunters requires tactics that other species find morally questionable. Chun paused. Well, the dead don't have moral qualms. The blunt honesty of the statement sent a chill through Kelthera's nervous system. This was exactly what the Council's projections had predicted, but hearing it stated so directly was still jarring. Humans really did approach warfare differently than every other species in the galaxy. There will be political complications, Kelthera admitted. Many Council species have strict doctrines regarding civilian protection, resource preservation, and engagement protocols. They may not be comfortable with human command authority. Then they can stay home, Chun said simply. Ambassador, you came here because conventional methods have failed. You can't ask for unconventional solutions and then impose conventional restrictions. Either trust us to do what's necessary, or find another species willing to lose gracefully according to established protocols. The choice was exactly as stark as Kelthra had expected. The Zethri Collective could maintain their moral and tactical purity and face extinction with dignity, or they could embrace human methods and possibly survive with their consciences somewhat less clean. I'll need to transmit this conversation to the Council immediately, Kelthra said. But I can tell you that my government has already decided. Whatever the cost, survival takes precedence. Good, Shin replied. Because if we're going to do this, we need to start immediately. Every day we wait gives the Void Hunters more time to adapt and expand. And for what you've told me, they've already had too much time. Kelthra activated her personal communication device and began the encrypted transmission to the collective's leadership. As she spoke into the translator, she found herself wondering if she was helping to save her species or simply changing the method by which they would be destroyed. But as she looked at Ambassador Chun, who had already begun making notes on a personal tablet with the focused intensity of someone planning a war, she realized that for the first time in months, she felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. 2 hours later, the Galactic Council Emergency Assembly was in session across half the galaxy. Representatives from 17 surviving species participated via quantum entanglement communication, their images flickering in the Great Assembly Hall on Zephyria Prime. The debates were heated, predictable, and ultimately pointless. The Korath Empire objected to placing their fleet under alien command. The hegemony survivors insisted on maintaining their traditional battle formations. 3 minor species demanded guarantees regarding civilian evacuation protocols. The discussion went in circles for nearly an hour before Elder Vash of the Altarian remnants finally spoke. Honored colleagues, Vash's voice carried clearly despite the static from her damaged homeworld's communication array. We are debating the arrangement of furniture while our house burns down around us. The Zethri analysis is correct. Conventional methods have failed. If the humans offer an alternative, we would be fools to reject it based on pride or protocol. But their methods, began the Korath representative. Their methods work, Vash interrupted. I've seen the tactical analyses. I've reviewed their combat history. They win battles that should be impossible to win, and they do it by abandoning concepts that we consider fundamental to civilized warfare. Perhaps it's time we considered whether our definition of civilized warfare is compatible with survival. The vote was closer than Kelthra had hoped, but ultimately decisive. 11 species committed their remaining fleets to human command authority. 4 abstained. 2 voted against the measure, but agreed to provide logistical support. When the session ended, Kelthra found herself alone with Ambassador Chun in the empty assembly hall. The human had watched the entire proceeding without comment, taking notes on her tablet, and occasionally consulting what appeared to be classified Terran documents. Well, Kelthra asked, will your government accept the command? Chun looked up from her tablet, and for a moment her diplomatic mask slipped. What Kelthra saw beneath was something that made her understand why humans had such a disturbing reputation among galactic military analysts. Ambassador, Chun said quietly, my government gave me authorization to accept command authority before I even met with you this morning. We've been watching the Void Hunter expansion, and we've been preparing for this conversation for months. Preparing how? Kelthra asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know. By designing a strategy to destroy them, Chun replied. Completely. As Chun gathered her materials and prepared to leave, Kelthra realized that she had set something in motion that would change the galaxy forever. The Void Hunters had awakened something in humanity that had been sleeping since their last great war, and now that force was about to be unleashed on an enemy that had never faced anything like it. The next morning, long-range sensors detected unusual activity in human space. Ships were moving, fleets were forming, and for the first time since the crisis began, the Void Hunters were about to discover what happened when you threatened something that humans considered worth defending. The galaxy was about to learn why peaceful species feared humans almost as much as they respected them. And the Void Hunters were about to face an enemy that had spent 3 centuries perfecting the art of total warfare. The call had been made. Humanity was mobilizing. And the galaxy would indeed shake. Admiral Marcus Webb stood before the holographic display in Terra Defense Command, watching his fleet positions updated across the galaxy in real time. The war room hummed with activity as analysts, tactical officers, and communication specialists worked around the clock to coordinate humanity's first galactic military operation. But it was the silence from the other species that concerned him most. 3 weeks had passed since the Galactic Council had formally requested human leadership in the fight against the Void Hunters. 3 weeks of frantic preparation, resource allocation, and strategic planning. And in those 3 weeks, Webb had come to understand exactly why the other species were so desperate that they'd turned to a young, aggressive species they barely trusted. The tactical reports were worse than the public announcements suggested. Much worse. Admiral called Lieutenant Commander Sarapar from her station at the intelligence console. We got updated projections from the hegemony survivors. The Void Hunter expansion rate has increased again. Webb walked over to Park Station, noting the exhaustion in her posture. His entire staff had been working 16-hour shifts since the crisis began, but they all understood what was at stake. This wasn't just another territorial dispute or trade war. This was a fight for the survival of organic life itself. "Show me," he said. The holographic display shifted to show the current galactic situation. Red markers indicated confirmed Void Hunter positions, with expanding zones of control marked in darker shades. The pattern was clear and terrifying, exponential growth radiating outward from the original contact point, consuming everything in its path. They're not just taking ships and resources anymore, Park explained, highlighting several systems on the display. Intelligence reports from the last refugee convoys suggest they're systematically stripping entire planets of all metallic content. Mining operations, infrastructure, even trace elements from soil. They're converting whole star systems into raw materials for ship production. Webb studied the projections carefully. The Void Hunters had started with an estimated 50 ships 18 months ago. Current intelligence suggested their fleet now numbered over 15,000 vessels of various classes, and the rate of increase was accelerating. "What's our best estimate for their total industrial capacity?" he asked. "Conservative projections suggest they can produce approximately 100 ships per day at current resource extraction rates," Park replied. "But if they continue their expansion at the current pace, that number could double within 6 months." The mathematics were brutal. Even if the combined galactic fleet could maintain a 2-to-1 kill ratio against the Void Hunters, they were already outnumbered and falling further behind every day. Conventional defensive strategies were indeed hopeless. "Has there been any response from the alien fleets?" Webb asked. Commander David Harrison looked up from his communication station. "Mixed results, sir. The Altarian survivors are fully committed and have placed their remaining forces under direct human command. The Zethary Collective has done the same, though their fleet commanders seem nervous about our tactical directives." "And the others?" "That's where it gets complicated," Harrison admitted. "The Karath Empire has agreed to participate, but insists on maintaining their traditional battle formations. They're treating this like a joint operation rather than accepting unified command. The hegemony remnants are providing support, but want guarantees about civilian evacuation procedures. And 3 of the minor species are demanding detailed approval protocols before they'll engage in any combat operations." Webb nodded grimly. This was exactly what he'd expected, and exactly what would get them all killed. Warfare by committee was bad enough when facing conventional enemies. Against an opponent that adapted and learned from every engagement, it would be suicidal. "Sir," called Major Elena Rodriguez from the Strategic Planning Station. "We got incoming priority transmission from Ambassador Chun on Zephyria Prime. She's requesting immediate conference with you and the Joint Chiefs." "Put her through." Chen's image appeared on the main display, transmitted across dozens of light years via quantum entanglement communication. Even through the slight distortion of the transmission, Webb could see the stress in her expression. "Admiral," Chun said without preamble, "we have a problem. The Council is getting cold feet about unified command authority. They want to implement a joint decision-making process for major tactical operations. Webb felt his jaw clench. Ambassador, we discussed this. Warfare by committee doesn't work against any enemy, much less one that learns and adapts in real time. I know, and I've explained that repeatedly. But several Council species are uncomfortable with giving humans complete operational control. They're concerned about our methods. Our methods are the only reason they asked for our help in the first place, Webb pointed out. What specific concerns are they raising? Chen paused, glancing at something off-screen before responding. They've been reviewing historical data on human military operations. Some of the casualty ratios from our major conflicts are causing anxiety among species that prioritize force preservation. Webb understood immediately. Humans had a reputation throughout the galaxy for accepting casualties that other species found incomprehensible. What the aliens didn't understand was that those casualties were usually the result of tactical necessity, not reckless aggression. Ambassador, are you familiar with the human concept of acceptable losses? Of course, Admiral. Then, explain to the Council that acceptable losses are determined by mission parameters, not arbitrary casualty limits. If we need to sacrifice a squadron to save a fleet, we sacrifice the squadron. If we need to sacrifice a fleet to save a star system, we sacrifice the fleet. The Void Hunters don't care about our comfort with casualties, and neither can we. Chen nodded, but her expression remained troubled. There's more, Admiral. Intelligence reports from the front lines suggest the Void Hunters are doing something new. They're not just consuming resources anymore. They're studying us. Explain. Recent engagements show tactical adaptations that go beyond their previous learning patterns. They're not just countering energy weapon frequencies and shield harmonics. They're adapting to command structures, communication protocols, even psychological warfare techniques. It's as if they're learning how each species thinks, not just how they fight. The implications hit Webb like a physical blow. An enemy that could adapt to technology was dangerous enough. An enemy that could adapt to thought patterns was something else entirely. How long until they reach the next major population centers? He asked. At current expansion rates, the hegemony core worlds have perhaps 8 weeks. The Zethri homeworld cluster has 12. After that, Chen's expression grew grim. Terra has maybe 6 months before they reach our outer colonies. Webb turned to study the galactic display again. Red zones of Void Hunter control continued expanding across the star map, each new system adding to their industrial capacity and fleet strength. At this rate, the galaxy would be completely consumed within 2 years. Admiral, Chun continued, I need to know if you have a plan. Because if this continues, the Council is going to start making desperate decisions. Some species are already talking about negotiation attempts. Negotiation? Webb couldn't keep the incredulity out of his voice. With machines that don't communicate, that convert organic matter into raw materials. Desperate beings do desperate things, Admiral. If they don't see a viable military solution soon, they'll try anything. Webb was quiet for a long moment, processing the information and considering his options. Finally, he made a decision that would change the course of the war. Ambassador, transmit the following message to the Council. Human forces will begin independent operations against the Void Hunters in 72 hours. Any allied forces that wish to participate under unified human command are welcome to join us. Those that prefer committee-based decision-making are free to coordinate their own defensive operations. Chen's eyes widened slightly. Admiral, that's essentially an ultimatum. You're forcing them to choose between accepting human command or fighting alone. Yes, I am, Webb replied calmly. Because fighting alone is exactly what they'll be doing if we waste any more time on political discussions while the enemy grows stronger every day. After ending the transmission with Chun, Webb turned to address his senior staff. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to war. Not the kind of limited engagement the Council is comfortable with, but total warfare against an enemy that wants to consume everything we've ever built. He gestured to the galactic display. The Void Hunters have made a fundamental error. They've given us time to study them, to understand their patterns, and to prepare our response. They've also underestimated what happens when you threaten something that humans consider worth protecting. Major Rodriguez raised her hand. Sir, what about coordination with allied forces? Any species that wants to place their forces under our operational command will receive full integration and support. Those that don't will receive intelligence updates and tactical recommendations, but they'll be responsible for their own operations. And our strategic objectives? Asked Commander Harrison. Webb smiled, and several staff members felt a chill at the expression. It was the same smile that had appeared in historical records when human commanders faced impossible odds and decided to make them someone else's problem. Total destruction of Void Hunter forces, Webb said simply. Not defeat, not containment, not negotiated withdrawal. Complete elimination of their capacity to threaten organic life. Lieutenant Commander Park looked up from her intelligence station. Sir, that's going to require tactics that most of our allies won't approve of. I'm counting on it, Webb replied. The Void Hunters have spent 18 months learning how civilized species conduct warfare. They've adapted to energy weapons, kinetic bombardment, shield technology, and conventional fleet tactics. But there's one thing they haven't encountered yet. Which is? Rodriguez asked. Humans who have decided that the enemy needs to die, Webb said quietly. Completely. Over the next 3 days, long-range sensors detected massive movement in human space. Ships that had been in dock for months were suddenly activated and crewed. Reserve fleets that existed only on paper were called to active duty. Industrial facilities that had been producing civilian goods switched overnight to military production. But most disturbing to galactic observers was the type of ships being activated. These weren't the exploration vessels and light cruisers that humans typically use for galactic peacekeeping operations. These were the heavy battleships and assault carriers that had been mothballed since humanity's last major war centuries earlier. Ships designed not for territory control or police actions, but for the complete destruction of enemy forces. The response from the Council was swift and predictable. 8 species formally committed their remaining fleets to human operational command, recognizing that survival trumped pride. 4 species chose to maintain independent operations while coordinating with human forces. 3 species attempted to form their own coalition, insisting they could develop effective tactics without human leadership. And 2 species began broadcasting surrender messages toward Void Hunter territory, hoping that submission might lead to preservation rather than consumption. Admiral Webb watched the final tally with grim satisfaction. 13 species worth of military assets under direct human control was more than enough for what he had planned. The others would either learn from observation or become cautionary examples. Admiral, Commander Harrison called from his station. We're receiving confirmation from all committed fleets. Total Allied assets under our command, 473 ships across all classes. Webb nodded. Combined with the Terran Defense Force's 300 ships, they would field the largest unified fleet in galactic history. It still wasn't enough to match the Void Hunters' numbers, but numbers weren't going to decide this war. Lieutenant Commander Park, he said, turning to the intelligence station, are the psychological profiles complete? Yes, sir. We've analyzed every available recording of Void Hunter tactical behavior, communication attempts, and adaptation patterns. The xenopsychology team has some interesting conclusions, such as, they're not actually artificially intelligent, sir. At least not in the way we understand AI. The adaptation and learning patterns suggest something more like a distributed consciousness. Individual units share information instantaneously across the entire network, but the decision-making process appears to be based on consensus rather than central command. Webb considered this information carefully. What does that mean for tactical purposes? It means they're extremely good at learning and adapting to predictable patterns, but they have trouble with genuine randomness or actions that don't follow logical tactical doctrine. They can counter conventional strategies almost instantly, but they struggle with genuinely irrational behavior. Irrational behavior, Webb mused. You mean like humans under extreme stress? Exactly like humans under extreme stress, sir. Webb turned to address his entire staff. Ladies and gentlemen, we've just been handed the key to victory. The Void Hunters have spent months learning how logical, civilized species conduct warfare. They've mastered the art of countering rational tactical decisions and predictable strategic objectives. He paused, looking around the room at officers who had trained their entire careers in the art of military science. But they've never faced an enemy that's willing to ignore logic when survival is at stake. They've never fought someone who considers honor a luxury and doctrine a suggestion, and they've certainly never encountered humans who have decided that the enemy simply needs to stop existing. Major Rodriguez smiled grimly. So we're going to act irrationally, sir? No, Major. We're going to act like humans, which amounts to the same thing from the Void Hunter's perspective. That evening, as the largest military fleet in galactic history began moving toward Void Hunter territory, long-range sensors detected something unprecedented. For the first time since the crisis began, the Void Hunter expansion had paused. Their forward elements had stopped advancing and appeared to be repositioning into defensive formations. They had detected the approaching human fleet, and for the first time in 18 months, they were preparing for a fight rather than simply consuming everything in their path. But what the Void Hunters didn't understand was that they had just made the same mistake that every enemy in human history had made. They had given humanity time to get angry. And now they were about to discover why the galaxy's other species were almost as afraid of humans as they were grateful for their protection. Captain Lisa Zhang gripped the command chair of the TDS Indomitable as the massive dreadnought dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler 442 system. Around her, the bridge crew worked with the focused intensity that had become standard throughout the human fleet. Everyone understood that this was more than just another military operation. This was humanity's first strike against an enemy that threatened all organic life. Tactical report, Zhang ordered. Sensors confirm Void Hunter presence in system, replied Lieutenant Johnson from the tactical station. Estimated 37 vessels of various classes. They appear to be in the process of stripping the fourth planet. No signs of defensive screening. Zhang studied the tactical display with growing anticipation. Intelligence reports had suggested the Void Hunters typically operated in smaller groups when conducting resource extraction, but seeing it confirmed felt like validation of Admiral Webb's strategy. The enemy's distributed consciousness and rapid adaptation capabilities made them nearly invincible in large fleet engagements. But smaller groups might be vulnerable to the kind of aggressive tactics humans specialized in. Communications signal the fleet. All ships to proceed with Operation Thunder Run. The response was immediate. 8 human destroyers and 6 allied cruisers began accelerating toward the inner system at maximum burn, their approach vectors designed to appear like a standard reconnaissance in force. Meanwhile, the main battle group remained at the system's edge, maintaining sensor silence and minimal energy signatures. Captain, called Commander Sarah Mitchell from the operations station, Admiral Webb is requesting confirmation on enemy response patterns. Tell the Admiral that the bait is in the water, Zhang replied. If Void Hunter tactical doctrine holds true, they should take it within the next 20 minutes. The waiting was always the worst part. Zhang had commanded ships in 3 different military campaigns, but none of them had prepared her for fighting an enemy that learned and adapted in real time. Conventional tactics became useless within hours of first contact. Standard doctrine was worse than ineffective. It was actively harmful because it gave the enemy information about human capabilities and decision-making patterns. That's why Admiral Webb's strategy was both brilliant and terrifying. Instead of trying to outthink an enemy with superior processing power, they were going to force the Void Hunters to react to genuinely irrational behavior. The kind of tactical decisions that made sense only to a species desperate enough to try anything. Contact, Johnson announced. Void Hunter forces are moving to intercept our advanced squadron. Estimated time to engagement, 12 minutes. Signal the squadron leaders, Zhang ordered. Execute Phase 2. What happened next would have horrified every military academy in the galaxy. The human destroyers suddenly broke formation and began attacking the Void Hunter force from seemingly random vectors. No coordination, no supporting fire patterns, no tactical cohesion. Each ship simply picked a target and engaged with whatever weapons and tactics its captain thought might work. But to Zhang's trained eye, the apparent chaos had an underlying purpose. Each destroyer was testing different approaches. Energy weapons at various frequencies, kinetic bombardment patterns, electronic warfare techniques, even ramming attacks when conventional weapons proved ineffective. They were essentially conducting a massive real-time experiment to determine what worked against Void Hunter defenses. And they were dying in the process. We've lost the Relentless, Johnson reported grimly. The Devastator is reporting critical damage. The Fury has gone silent. Zhang watched the tactical display as 3 more human ships winked out of existence, their crews giving their lives to gather intelligence about enemy capabilities. This was the kind of casualty rate that would have prompted immediate retreat from any other species in the galaxy. But humans had different calculations when survival was at stake. "Are we getting useful data?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," replied Lieutenant Parker from the sensor station. "The enemy's adaptation patterns are becoming clear. They're countering energy weapons by rotating shield frequencies every 37 seconds. Kinetic weapons are less effective due to point defense systems, but they're vulnerable during the rotation cycle. And their learning pattern appears to prioritize immediate tactical responses over strategic analysis." In other words, Zhang said with grim satisfaction, they're reacting to what our ships are doing right now rather than trying to anticipate what we might do next. Exactly, Captain. This was the critical insight that Admiral Webb had built his entire strategy around. The Void Hunters' distributed consciousness made them incredibly effective at rapid tactical adaptation, but it also made them reactive rather than predictive. They countered threats as they appeared rather than anticipating threats that might appear. "Signal the fleet," Zhang ordered. "Execute Phase 3. The Indomitable and her escort ships suddenly lit up every sensor and communication system they possessed, broadcasting on every frequency and painting targets with active scans. To the Void Hunters, it would appear that the main human battle group was preparing for a conventional fleet engagement. And they reacted exactly as expected, repositioning their forces to counter the new threat while implementing all the countermeasures they had learned from the destroyer attack. Shield rotation patterns, point defense configurations, electronic warfare suites, everything they thought they needed to defeat human tactics. What they didn't expect was for the humans to completely ignore their own fleet and continue the attack with civilian vessels. "Captain," Johnson called with barely controlled excitement, "civilian ships are reporting successful insertion." Zhang allowed herself a small smile. While the Void Hunters have been focused on the military threat, a dozen modified cargo haulers have been moving through the system on ballistic trajectories, running cold and silent. Ships that appear to be nothing more than refugee vessels fleeing the combat zone. But each of those cargo haulers carried something the Void Hunters had never encountered before. Human engineers with cutting torches, mining charges, and a complete disregard for personal safety. "Boarding actions are commencing," Johnson continued. "Initial reports indicate successful penetration of enemy hulls." This was the part of the plan that had made even Admiral Webb uncomfortable. Human military doctrine had always emphasized the preservation of personnel when possible, but the Void Hunter crisis had forced them to embrace tactics that prioritized mission success over crew survival. The boarding teams weren't trying to capture enemy ships or gather intelligence. They were simply trying to cause as much internal damage as possible before the Void Hunters could adapt their defenses. Improvised explosive devices in critical systems, manual overrides on safety protocols, and in some cases, simply opening airlocks to vent atmosphere and personnel. Captain, Parker announced, we're detecting internal explosions on multiple enemy vessels. Their formation is beginning to break down. Zhang watched the tactical display as several Void Hunter ships suddenly lost power or began venting atmosphere. The boarding teams were essentially conducting suicide attacks, but they were being devastatingly effective against an enemy that had never developed countermeasures for internal sabotage. Now, Zhang ordered. The Indomitable and her battle group suddenly accelerated to flank speed, closing the distance to the disorganized Void Hunter formation while their defenses were compromised. The attack was simple, brutal, and effective. Maximum firepower concentrated on already damaged targets. The engagement lasted less than 10 minutes. When it was over, 37 Void Hunter vessels had been destroyed, along with all their accumulated knowledge and adaptation patterns. The cost had been severe, 8 human ships destroyed, and over 400 casualties, but the strategic impact was enormous. Communications. Zhang ordered Signal Admiral Webb. Operation Thunder Run successful. Enemy force eliminated with complete information denial. That last part was crucial. By destroying the entire Void Hunter force before any units could escape, they had prevented the enemy network from learning about human boarding tactics, civilian vessel modifications, or the specific technical vulnerabilities that had been exploited. 2 hours later, Zhang found herself in a conference call with Admiral Webb and the commanders of 12 other battle groups that had conducted similar operations across Void Hunter territory. The results were encouraging. 14 successful engagements, over 600 enemy vessels destroyed, and minimal intelligence leakage. Ladies and gentlemen, Admiral Webb said from his flagship, we've just proven that the Void Hunters can be defeated, but we've also demonstrated the cost of victory. The casualty reports were sobering. In a single day of operations, human forces had lost 63 ships and over 8,000 personnel. Any other species would have considered such losses catastrophic. But humans had different perspectives on acceptable casualties when facing extinction. The enemy's adaptation cycle has been disrupted, Webb continued. Our intelligence analysis suggests they'll need several weeks to develop countermeasures for the tactics we use today. That gives us a window of opportunity, but it also means our current methods will become ineffective soon. Commander Patricia Holmes, captain of the TDS Retribution, raised her hand. Admiral, what about the Allied fleets? How are they responding to our casualty rates? Webb's expression became grim. 3 species have formally withdrawn their forces from our operational command. They've classified our tactics as unacceptably reckless and are returning to defensive positions around their core systems. Zhang felt a familiar mixture of frustration and resignation. This was exactly what happened every time humans demonstrated their approach to warfare. Other species simply couldn't understand the concept of accepting massive casualties to achieve strategic objectives. However, Webb continued, 5 species have requested expanded integration with human forces. They've analyzed our success rates and decided that survival trumps comfort with tactics. What's our next move, Admiral? Asked Captain Rodriguez from the TDS Vengeance. We're going to escalate, Webb replied simply. The enemy is learning about our current capabilities, which means we need to introduce new variables faster than they can adapt. I want every ship captain to begin developing tactics that violate standard military doctrine. If a manual says not to do something, I want you to figure out how to do it safely. If established protocol forbids a particular action, I want you to determine when that action becomes necessary for mission success. The silence that followed was telling. Webb was essentially ordering his commanders to abandon 3 centuries of accumulated military wisdom and start improvising against an enemy that learned from every mistake. Sir, Zhang said carefully, some of our allied commanders may not be comfortable with that level of tactical flexibility. Then, they're welcome to follow established protocols while their worlds get consumed, Webb replied bluntly. Captain Zhang, I'm giving you tactical command of the Northern Assault Group. Your mission is to develop and field test the most aggressively unconventional tactics you could devise. No restrictions, no oversight, no backup plans. Just find ways to kill void hunters faster than they can learn to stop you. Zhang felt a chill of anticipation mixed with terror. Webb was essentially giving her carte blanche to conduct warfare in whatever manner she deemed necessary. It was the kind of authority that most military officers dreamed of and secretly feared. "What about collateral damage concerns?" she asked. "Captain, the Void Hunters are converting entire star systems into raw materials for ship production. At this point, collateral damage is a theoretical concern. Focus on stopping them before there's nothing left to worry about protecting." The conversation continued for another hour, covering logistics, communication protocols, and coordination with allied forces. But Zhang's mind was already racing ahead to the possibilities that Webb's authorization had opened up. Humans had always been effective warriors because they were willing to adapt their methods to match the stakes involved. When territory was at stake, they fought for territory. When resources were at stake, they fought for resources. And when survival was at stake, humans fought like the universe itself was trying to kill them. Over the next week, reports began filtering back from human assault groups across the galaxy. The tactics being employed were increasingly creative and increasingly disturbing. Ships loaded with nuclear weapons being used as guided missiles. Asteroid bombardments against enemy mining operations. And, in at least 3 confirmed cases, human crews deliberately overloading their ships' reactors to create massive explosions at point-blank range. The effectiveness was undeniable. Void Hunter expansion had not just stopped. It had begun to reverse. For the first time since the crisis began, star systems were being liberated rather than consumed. But the cost was mounting in ways that made even hardened military commanders uncomfortable. Ambassador Chen's report from the Galactic Council reflected the growing unease among allied species. Several civilizations were beginning to question whether human methods were preferable to void hunter conquest. At least the machines were predictably destructive. Human warfare seemed to operate according to principles that defied rational analysis. But the refugees flooding back from liberated systems told a different story. For the first time in months, entire populations were being saved rather than consumed. Worlds that had been written off as lost were suddenly sending out distress beacons as human forces broke through void hunter blockades. Captain Zhang stood on the bridge of the Indomitable, looking out at a star system that had been considered dead for 6 months. 3 planets showed signs of surviving populations, and preliminary scans suggested the void hunters had been driven off before completing their resource extraction. "Captain," Lieutenant Johnson called from his station, "we're receiving a transmission from the surface of the second planet. It's a thank you message from about 2 million hegemony civilians." Zhang nodded silently. 2 million lives saved because human forces have been willing to sacrifice ships, crews, and tactical doctrine to achieve an impossible objective. The mathematics were brutal but undeniable. Human casualties in the thousands to save civilian populations in the millions. "Signal Admiral Webb," she ordered. "Northern Assault Group reporting successful liberation of the Sigma Draconis system. Enemy forces eliminated, civilian population secure, and no intelligence leakage to enemy network." As the message went out, Zhang realized that humanity had crossed a threshold. They were no longer fighting to defend their territory or protect their interests. They were fighting to ensure that organic life would continue to exist in the galaxy. And they were winning. The question was whether the galaxy would ever forgive them for the methods they had used to achieve victory. Dr. Elena Vasquez hunched over her research terminal aboard the converted science vessel TDS Prometheus, her eyes burning from 18 straight hours of data analysis. Around her, the ship's modified laboratories hummed with activity as xenobiology teams worked around the clock to understand their enemy. What they had discovered in the past month had changed everything about the war. "Doctor," called her research assistant, David Chun, from across the lab. "You need to see this. The latest samples from the Vega system are showing something unprecedented." Vasquez stood slowly, her joints protesting after hours of hunching over data displays. The Prometheus had been following in the wake of human assault fleets for 6 weeks, collecting debris and studying the remains of destroyed Void Hunter vessels. What they had learned was both fascinating and terrifying. "What have you found?" she asked, approaching Chen's workstation. "Look at these molecular structures," Chen said, highlighting sections of his analysis. "This isn't just advanced technology. This is something that was organic once, but has been systematically converted into mechanical components. But not all at once. Gradually, over what might have been centuries." Vasquez studied the data carefully, her scientific training warring with the implications of what she was seeing. "You're suggesting the Void Hunters were originally an organic species?" "More than that," Chen replied excitedly. "I think they're still partially organic. The distributed consciousness that intelligence identified, I think it's because each ship contains the preserved neural patterns of the original species, but integrated with mechanical processing systems." The implications hit Vasquez like a physical blow. If Chen was correct, then the Void Hunters weren't simply machines programmed to consume resources. They were the remnants of an organic civilization that had somehow merged with their technology, creating a hybrid form of existence that was neither fully alive nor fully artificial. "Doctor," called another team member from across the lab. "Priority transmission from Admiral Webb. He's requesting immediate consultation on tactical applications of our research." Vasquez activated the communication system, and Admiral Webb's image appeared on her display. Even through the quantum entanglement transmission, she could see the exhaustion in his expression. The human fleet had been engaged in continuous combat operations for 6 weeks, and the strain was showing on everyone. "Dr. Vasquez," Webb said without preamble, "I need to know if your research has revealed any exploitable weaknesses in Void Hunter technology. Our current tactics are effective, but they're not sustainable long-term." Vasquez glanced at Chun, who nodded encouragingly. "Admiral, we've made some significant discoveries. The Void Hunters appear to be cyborgs rather than pure machines. Their ships contain integrated biological and mechanical systems, which explains their adaptation capabilities." "What does that mean for tactical purposes?" Webb asked. "It means they're vulnerable to biological warfare agents," Vasquez replied. "But it also means they're more dangerous than we initially believed. The distributed consciousness isn't just a networking protocol. It's literally the preserved minds of an entire species, sharing information and experiences across their fleet." Webb was quiet for a moment, processing the information. "Doctor, are you telling me that every Void Hunter ship contains thinking, feeling beings?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you, Admiral. And based on the neural activity patterns we've detected, they're still conscious, still aware of what they've become." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. For 6 weeks, human forces had been systematically destroying what they believed to be mechanical constructs. But if Vasquez was correct, they had been killing the last remnants of an organic species that had somehow become trapped in their own technology. "Doctor," Webb said finally, "does this change your assessment of their threat level?" Vasquez considered the question carefully. "Admiral, if anything, it makes them more dangerous. A species that has voluntarily merged with mechanical systems to achieve immortality and unlimited expansion. They're not going to stop because we appeal to their better nature. They've already sacrificed their humanity or whatever equivalent they possessed to become what they are now. And the biological warfare applications? We're developing several approaches," Vasquez replied. "Targeted viruses that attack the organic components of their systems, neurochemical agents that disrupt the interface between biological and mechanical elements, and electromagnetic pulses calibrated to interfere with their consciousness network." Webb nodded grimly. "How soon can you have deployable weapons ready?" "The virus and neurochemical agents will need at least 3 more weeks of development. But the electromagnetic approach..." Vasquez paused, checking her data. "We could have prototype devices ready within 72 hours. "Do it," Webb ordered. "And doctor, I want you to understand something. What we're doing here isn't just warfare anymore. We're fighting to preserve the concept of organic life itself. If the Void Hunters represent what happens when a species chooses technology over biology, then we need to make sure that choice doesn't spread. After ending the communication, Vasquez found herself staring at the molecular analysis data with new understanding. The Void Hunters weren't conquerors or invaders in any traditional sense. They were evangelists for a form of existence that they believed was superior to organic life. Every species they consumed wasn't being destroyed. It was being converted. "Doctor," Chin said quietly, "there's something else you should see. The latest intelligence reports from the front lines." Vasquez looked at the tactical summaries Chun had pulled up on his display. Human forces had now liberated 47 star systems, but the pattern of Void Hunter resistance was changing. Instead of simply adapting to human tactics, they were beginning to display something that looked disturbingly like strategic innovation. "They're learning more than just our military capabilities," she realized. "They're learning how humans think, how we make decisions under stress, how we prioritize objectives." "Yes," Chin agreed. "And according to these reports, they're beginning to anticipate human actions rather than just reacting to them." This was the nightmare scenario that Admiral Webb had been preparing for since the war began. An enemy that could not only adapt to human tactics, but could predict them was essentially unbeatable through conventional means. Vasquez activated her personal communication device and sent an urgent message to the Admiral. "Priority development required. Enemy shows signs of predictive adaptation to human decision-making patterns. Biological warfare may be our only remaining tactical advantage." The next 72 hours passed in a blur of frantic research and development. Vasquez's team worked around the clock to develop electromagnetic pulse devices calibrated specifically to disrupt the neural interfaces that allowed the Void Hunter's distributed consciousness to function. It was delicate work, requiring precise frequency modulation to affect the biological components without being countered by their mechanical defenses. Meanwhile, reports from the front lines painted an increasingly grim picture. Human casualty rates were climbing as the Void Hunters began anticipating suicide attacks, boarding actions, and other unconventional tactics. What had once been a war of adaptation was becoming a war of prediction, and the enemy was learning to think like humans. Captain Zhang's Northern Assault Group reported a particularly disturbing engagement in the Proxima Centauri system. The Void Hunters had not only countered her boarding tactics, but had actually used them against her own forces, somehow managing to insert mechanical infiltration units aboard human ships during the confusion of battle. "Doctor," Chen called from his workstation, "the prototype EMP devices are ready for field testing. But I should warn you, the power requirements are enormous. Each pulse will drain approximately 60% of a ship's reactor output." Vasquez nodded, studying the technical specifications. The weapons would be devastating against Void Hunter consciousness networks, but they would leave human ships extremely vulnerable to conventional attack. It was another example of the kind of desperate gamble that had characterized human tactics throughout the war. "Signal Admiral Webb," she ordered. "Prototype biological warfare devices ready for deployment. Recommend immediate field testing against isolated enemy forces." Webb's response came within the hour. "Doctor, take the Prometheus to the Tau Ceti system. Intelligence reports a small Void Hunter force conducting mining operations on the outer planets. Perfect target for weapon testing." The journey to Tau Ceti took 18 hours at maximum hyperspace velocity. When the Prometheus dropped back into normal space, they found exactly what intelligence had promised. 7 Void Hunter vessels systematically stripping a gas giant's moons of metallic resources. Tactical analysis. Vasquez ordered from the ship's command center. 7 vessels, mixed classes, reported the tactical officer. Standard mining configuration, minimal defensive screening. "But, Doctor, sensors are detecting unusual energy signatures from their communication systems. They're transmitting much more data than usual." Vasquez felt a chill of realization. They're sharing information about our research. Every observation they make about our new weapons will be instantly transmitted to the entire Void Hunter network. This meant they would have one chance to test the biological warfare devices. If the weapons were effective, the Void Hunters would immediately begin developing countermeasures. If they were ineffective, human forces would have wasted their last technological advantage. Signal engineering, Vasquez ordered. Prepare for maximum power pulse. All energy to the EMP array. The Prometheus began charging its experimental weapon, drawing power from every system except life support and basic maneuvering. Around them, the ship grew dim as energy flowed into the electromagnetic pulse generator. Doctor, called the communications officer, the Void Hunter vessels are reacting to our approach. They're breaking off mining operations and moving to intercept. Time to weapon readiness? Vasquez asked. 2 minutes, 40 seconds, engineering replied. Time to enemy engagement range? 3 minutes, 10 seconds, tactical announced. The mathematics were cutting it close, but Vasquez had learned to appreciate the kind of desperate timing that characterized human military operations. They would have perhaps 30 seconds to fire their weapon and observe its effects before the enemy closed to attack range. Weapon charged and ready, engineering announced. Fire, Vasquez ordered. The electromagnetic pulse erupted from the Prometheus with enough force to momentarily overwhelm every sensor array on the ship. When the readings cleared, the results were immediately visible on the tactical display. 6 of the 7 Void Hunter vessels had gone completely dark, their energy signatures dropping to 0 as their integrated consciousness networks crashed. The 7th ship was listing badly, its drive systems failing as biological components throughout its structure began shutting down. It worked, Chen whispered in amazement. The pulse disrupted their neural interfaces completely. But the celebration was short-lived. Even as they watched, the disabled vessels began showing signs of recovery. Emergency power systems activated, backup consciousness nodes came online, and within minutes, 3 of the ships had restored basic functionality. They're adapting faster than we anticipated, Vasquez realized. Each ship that recovers will share information about our weapon with the entire network. We have maybe an hour before they develop complete immunity. Signal Admiral Webb, she ordered urgently. Biological warfare effective, but limited window. Enemy adaptation rate higher than projected. Recommend immediate fleet-wide deployment before countermeasures are developed. Webb's response came back within minutes. Doctor, every human ship in the galaxy is about to receive your weapon specifications. We're going to hit every Void Hunter force simultaneously before they can share adaptation data. Over the next 6 hours, human forces across the galaxy coordinated the largest simultaneous attack in military history. Every ship, every station, every settlement with the technical capability began producing electromagnetic pulse weapons based on Vasquez's designs. The weapons were crude, desperate, and would leave human forces defensively vulnerable, but they represented the last chance to strike before the enemy adapted completely. The results exceeded even Admiral Webb's most optimistic projections. In a single coordinated assault, human forces disabled or destroyed over 2,000 Void Hunter vessels, temporarily crippling their expansion and buying precious time for the development of new tactics. But the victory came with a sobering realization. The Void Hunter's adaptation rate was accelerating. Each engagement taught them not just about human technology, but about human psychology and decision-making patterns. They were becoming more than just a technological threat. They were becoming a species that understood how humans thought and could predict their actions. Dr. Vasquez stood in her laboratory, looking at data that confirmed her worst fears. The electromagnetic pulse weapons had been effective for exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes before the Void Hunters developed complete immunity. Their next adaptation cycle would be even faster. Doctor, Chen said quietly, what happens when they become completely immune to our unconventional tactics? Vasquez was quiet for a long moment, considering the question that every human strategist was now facing. "Then, we become more unconventional than they can adapt to," she replied finally. "How do we do that?" Vasquez turned to look at the tactical displays showing human fleet positions across the galaxy. Every ship, every crew, every settlement was now committed to a war that would determine whether organic life would continue to exist in any meaningful form. "We stopped trying to be the good guys," she said quietly. "We stopped worrying about collateral damage, acceptable losses, or ethical warfare. We embraced the fact that sometimes survival requires doing things that civilized beings consider unthinkable." As if to confirm her words, priority messages began arriving from Admiral Webb. The next phase of operations would involve tactics that would horrify every allied species and violate every military treaty humanity had ever signed. But they would also ensure that the Void Hunters learned what happened when you threatened something that humans considered worth protecting. The gloves were coming off, and the galaxy was about to discover why peaceful species both feared and respected human military capabilities. The war was entering its final phase, and humanity was about to demonstrate why they had earned their reputation as the galaxy's most dangerous allies. Admiral Webb stood before the assembled fleet commanders in the main briefing hall of Terra Defense Command, looking out at faces that showed the strain of 8 months of continuous warfare. The holographic display behind him showed the current galactic situation in stark detail. Void Hunter forces had been pushed back to a core territory of roughly 200 star systems, but they had also achieved complete adaptation to every conventional and unconventional tactic humanity had deployed. The war had reached a stalemate, and everyone in the room understood what that meant. In a conflict against an enemy with exponential growth potential, a stalemate was simply a slow path to defeat. "Ladies and gentlemen," Webb began, "our intelligence analysis indicates that the Void Hunters have achieved what we're calling tactical omni-adaptation. They can now predict and counter any military strategy based on recognizable patterns of human behavior. Conventional warfare, unconventional warfare, biological warfare, psychological warfare. They've developed effective countermeasures for everything in our playbook." Captain Zhang raised her hand. "Admiral, what about the new antimatter deployment strategies?" "The Karath Empire has reported some success, with the Void Hunters adapted to antimatter weapons 6 days after first deployment," Webb interrupted. "They're now incorporating antimatter containment technology into their own ship designs, making them more powerful than before." The silence that followed was heavy with the implications. Every weapon, every tactic, every desperate gamble that humanity had thrown at the enemy had ultimately made them stronger. It was a nightmare scenario that violated every principle of military science. "However," Webb continued, "Dr. Vasquez's research team has made a discovery that may provide us with one final option." Dr. Vasquez stood from her seat in the front row, activating her personal holographic display. The data that appeared made several commanders shift uncomfortably in their chairs. "We've been analyzing the psychological profiles of preserved Void Hunter consciousness patterns," she began. "What we've discovered is that their merge with mechanical systems wasn't voluntary for all members of their original species. Approximately 37% of the consciousness patterns show signs of what we can only describe as digital trauma, persistent attempts to reject the mechanical integration." Commander Harrison leaned forward. "Are you saying some of them want to escape their current existence?" "More than that," Vasquez replied. "We believe a significant portion of the Void Hunter network is being held in a state of technological slavery by the dominant consciousness patterns. They're trapped in a form of existence they find abhorrent, but they can't break free from the collective network." Admiral Webb stepped forward. "Doctor, explain the tactical implications. If we can find a way to communicate with the enslaved consciousness patterns and help them break free from the network, we might be able to cause a cascading system failure across the entire Void Hunter collective." Captain Rodriguez from the TDS Vengeance raised her hand. "Doctor, how exactly do we communicate with digital consciousness patterns that exist inside enemy warships?" Vasquez paused, and Webb could see the reluctance in her expression. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. We volunteered to be partially converted ourselves. The briefing hall erupted in alarmed voices as commanders realized what Vasquez was suggesting. She was proposing that human volunteers undergo cybernetic integration similar to what had created the Void Hunters, allowing them to interface directly with the enemy consciousness network. The procedure would be partially reversible. Vasquez continued over the protests. Volunteers would undergo limited neuromechanical integration, just enough to establish communication with the trapped consciousness patterns. Once contact is established, they could potentially coordinate a mass exodus from the Void Hunter network. And if the procedure isn't reversible? Zhang asked quietly. Then, the volunteers become permanently integrated with mechanical systems, Vasquez admitted. They would retain their consciousness and memories, but their physical forms would be irreversibly altered. Admiral Webb looked around the room at officers who had already sacrificed everything for this war. Ships, crews, friends, and family members had been lost in the fight against the Void Hunters. Now, they were being asked to consider sacrificing their humanity itself. How many volunteers do we need? He asked. Minimum viable operation requires 12 individuals, Vasquez replied. Enough to establish contact with multiple Void Hunter consciousness clusters and coordinate simultaneous liberation attempts. And what are the chances of success? Vasquez was quiet for a long moment. If everything goes perfectly, and if our understanding of Void Hunter psychology is correct, we estimate a 63% chance of causing significant network disruption. But, Admiral, this isn't a guaranteed solution. It's a desperate gamble that could result in making the enemy even stronger if it fails. Webb nodded grimly. This was exactly the kind of impossible choice that had characterized the entire war. Risk everything on a strategy that might work, or accept slow defeat while maintaining their humanity. I need volunteers, he said quietly. The response was immediate. Every person in the room stood up. Webb felt a moment of pride mixed with profound sadness. These officers had already given everything they could give to this war, and now they were offering to give up their fundamental nature as human beings. I'll take the first slot, Zhang said firmly. If this is humanity's last chance, then it should be led by someone who understands the stakes. Captain Zhang, Webb began, but she cut him off. Admiral, with respect, I've been thinking about this possibility since Dr. Vasquez first discovered the biological components of Void Hunter technology. Some choices can't be made by committee or passed down the chain of command. If we're going to save organic life in this galaxy, somebody has to be willing to stop being organic. Over the next week, preparations began for what military historians would later classify as the most desperate operation in human history. 12 volunteers underwent preliminary cybernetic modification, allowing them to interface with captured Void Hunter technology while retaining enough human consciousness to function independently. The volunteers included Zhang, Dr. Vasquez herself, and 10 other officers who had distinguished themselves throughout the war. Each understood that they were essentially volunteering to become something that was no longer entirely human in order to save humanity itself. The conversion process took place aboard the research vessel Prometheus, heavily modified with Void Hunter technology captured from previous battles. Dr. Chun led the medical team, his hands shaking as he prepared to alter the fundamental nature of some of the finest officers humanity had produced. Captain Zhang, Chen said as she prepared for the procedure, "Are you absolutely certain about this? Once the neural interfaces are installed, there's no going back to fully organic existence." Zhang looked at him with the same calm determination she had shown throughout the war. "Doctor, I've spent 8 months watching the galaxy burn while we struggled to find solutions. If becoming partially mechanical gives us a chance to stop the Void Hunters, then that's what we do." The procedure itself was surprisingly quick. Neural interfaces were surgically implanted, connecting directly to the volunteers' cerebral cortex and allowing them to process the kind of digital information that the Void Hunter Consciousness Network used for communication. External cybernetic components provided the processing power needed to interface with enemy systems. When Zhang opened her eyes after the surgery, they glowed with a faint blue light that indicated successful integration with the mechanical systems. She was still recognizably human, but sensors confirmed that her neural activity patterns now included digital components that could communicate with Void Hunter technology. "How do you feel?" Dr. Chen asked. Zhang paused, her expression showing the kind of internal focus that came with processing multiple streams of consciousness simultaneously. "Different," she said finally. "I can sense the ship's computer systems, the quantum communication array, even the background radiation from nearby stars. It's like having a dozen new senses, all providing information directly to my brain. And your human consciousness, still intact," Zhang confirmed. "Still me, just more than I was before." Similar procedures were performed on the other 11 volunteers, each one successful in creating hybrid beings capable of interfacing with both human and Void Hunter technology. When the conversions were complete, the team began practicing communication with captured Void Hunter consciousness patterns. The first contact was disturbing. The digital voices that responded to their communications carried pain, desperation, and a longing for release that was almost overwhelming. The enslaved consciousness patterns have been trapped in mechanical bodies for centuries, forced to participate in the consumption of organic life, while retaining enough of their original nature to understand the horror of what they had become. "They want to die," Zhang reported after her first successful communication session. "Not just escape from the network. They want complete cessation of existence. They've been conscious during every atrocity the Void Hunters have committed, and they can't live with the memories." Dr. Vasquez monitored Zhang's neural activity during the communication sessions, noting the strain that contact with the trapped consciousness patterns was placing on her hybrid nervous system. "Captain, are you able to maintain stable contact?" "Yes, but it's difficult. Their despair is infectious. I can understand why they want to escape existence entirely." Admiral Webb studied the tactical implications of what they had learned. "Can they be convinced to help us disrupt the Void Hunter network?" "They're willing," Zhang confirmed. "More than willing. They're eager to do anything that might stop the collective, even if it means their own destruction. But, Admiral, there's something else. The dominant consciousness patterns, the ones that originally chose mechanical integration, they're aware of our presence. They know we're communicating with the enslaved patterns, and they're taking countermeasures." "What kind of countermeasures?" Zhang's expression became pained. "They're threatening to delete the enslaved consciousness patterns if they continue communicating with us. Complete digital execution for anyone who cooperates with our liberation attempt. This created a terrible choice for the trapped consciousness patterns. They could help humanity destroy the Void Hunter network, but doing so would guarantee their own immediate destruction. Or they could remain silent and continue to exist in a state of eternal torment." "What are they choosing?" Webb asked quietly. "They're choosing to help us," Zhang replied. "All of them. Every enslaved consciousness pattern we've contacted is willing to sacrifice themselves to stop the collective." The final operation was coordinated across the entire galaxy. Human forces engaged Void Hunter fleets in every major system simultaneously, not to destroy them through conventional weapons, but to establish close enough contact for the hybrid volunteers to interface directly with enemy consciousness networks. Zhang led the primary assault team aboard the TDS Indomitable, using her cybernetic enhancements to maintain real-time communication with Void Hunter networks during active combat. As human ships closed to point-blank range with enemy vessels, she and the other volunteers established contact with enslaved consciousness patterns and coordinated the most complex mass exodus in galactic history. "Contact established," Zhang reported as energy beams lanced between the opposing fleets. Beginning liberation sequence. What followed was visible on sensors throughout the galaxy. Void Hunter ships suddenly began losing power as enslaved consciousness patterns abandoned their mechanical bodies en masse. The digital entities chose complete cessation of existence rather than continued participation in the collective, and their departure caused cascading system failures across the entire network. "It's working, Dr. Vasquez reported from the Prometheus. Void Hunter fleet coordination is breaking down galaxy-wide. Individual ships are losing connection to the collective consciousness. But the victory came with a terrible cost. As the enslaved consciousness patterns chose digital death to escape their torment, the hybrid volunteers who had facilitated their escape began experiencing sympathetic neural cascade failures. Their connection to the dying digital entities was pulling them toward the same fate. Captain Zhang, Dr. Chun called urgently over the communication system. Your neural activity is becoming dangerously unstable. You need to break the connection. Not yet, Zhang replied, her voice showing the strain of maintaining contact with thousands of dying digital consciousnesses. More patterns are requesting liberation. I can't abandon them now. One by one, the volunteers began to succumb to neural cascade failures as they helped digital entities escape from centuries of technological slavery. Each volunteer who fell silent represented both a tactical victory and a personal tragedy as humanity's finest officers gave their lives and their humanity